Tonight I want you to picture a few scenes with me from the 1850s and 60s. These are the Civil War days, and specifically the life of Abraham Lincoln. These scenes come courtesy of a book that was written not too long ago by a historian named Doris Kearns Goodwin, and I'll tell you more about that book in a minute. The first scene I want you to picture is Abraham Lincoln waiting in the telegraph office at night, waiting for news from the battlefronts, waiting for news from the war. According to this historian, he spent many an hour and many a night waiting in the telegraph office, waiting like you might wait for a loved one who's having surgery while you're waiting in the waiting room to hear what has happened. And many times, Lincoln would not spend that time waiting in the telegraph office alone. Several of the members of his presidential cabinet would also wait there with him too. One of those was named William Seward. Another one was named Edwin Bates. Another one was named Edward Stanton. There were others of them too. Sometimes they would gather together. They would put their hands together, hold hands with one another, and they would pray. And they would wait for news of whether it was 5,000 or whether it was 10,000 who may have lost their lives that very day in the war. So I hope you've got this picture in your mind. You've got Lincoln and the members of his presidential cabinet, hand in hand, in the telegraph office, waiting. Okay, now I want you to picture whose hands they are that are joined together in that circle. And this is where this book by Doris Kearns Goodwin really is helpful to us. Her book is called Team of Rivals. I don't know if you've ever heard of this book before, but the whole idea of the book is that when Abraham Lincoln was elected to be president and it came time for him to surround himself and form his presidential cabinet, who were going to be the closest colleagues and advisors to him, Abraham Lincoln chose for those positions, in many cases, the very people who had been his rivals, the ones who had run up against him in his campaigns, the ones who had challenged him throughout his career. Lincoln formed this team around him, a team of rivals. And I'll give you two examples. So one of the members of Lincoln's cabinet was that fellow I mentioned earlier named William Seward. And this was the runner-up for the presidential bid when Lincoln won the presidency. He was the favorite. He was the one who was supposed to win. And in fact, on the very night that the votes came in, he had 10,000 people outside of his estate-like home in New York there for a party. They already had the champagne ready to celebrate, and then he loses. And the very next day, he gets a message from Lincoln. Now, it wasn't just a thing in our time for politicians to drag each other's names through the mud in campaigns and try to do all the name calling that people do. And this fellow did a lot of that to Lincoln. And yet that very next day, the message comes, and Lincoln invites him to be in his circle of advisors. Then there was this other fellow, Edward Stanton. This is probably the more surprising one, because Edward Stanton and Abraham Lincoln had actually crossed paths several years earlier. Both of them were lawyers. Edward Stanton was actually a nationally renowned lawyer from Ohio, very well established in his field. Lincoln, of course, was just kind of a local lawyer in Illinois who had grown up on the frontier, not spent much of his life even going to school, taught himself, and he's kind of making his way as a lawyer. Well, one time, Edward Stanton was trying this big case. And the judges moved the case from Ohio to Illinois. And so his law firm thought maybe we should add someone to the team who could be from Illinois and kind of know these judges that we're going to try this case for. So some way or another, they come across Abraham Lincoln. They add him to the case. So Lincoln is elated by this. He gets to work with this nationally renowned lawyer, Edward Stanton. Everybody's heard of him. And so he spends all summer long working on this brief and just really working tirelessly and studying the case and working it over in his mind. And at the end of the summer, they moved the case back from Illinois to Ohio. And now they don't really need Lincoln anymore. Problem is, nobody tells him. So he keeps on working and working away in Illinois. Nobody ever tells him he's not on the case anymore. He comes on his own dime to Ohio because he's heard that the place has changed. He shows up. He meets Edward Stanton for the very first time. He says, let's go up to the courthouse, look over these things together. And Edward Stanton takes one look at Lincoln. His shirt's all worn out. The legs of his pants are too short for his long legs. And Edward Stanton says to his colleague, I'll quote this, "We've got to lose this long-armed ape. Having him here will hurt our case." And they never looked at a single thing that Lincoln had prepared for the case. They went on without him. And then Lincoln becomes president, and when he's forming his cabinet, he invites Edward Stanton to be one of the people who shares in his presidential cabinet. And there they are in the telegraph office. You see them joining hand in hand, waiting for news from the battlefield. Why would Lincoln surround himself with advisors like Seward and Stanton? People asked him this. Lincoln said, it's simple. These are some of the strongest, most able men in our country. And the country's in peril. I cannot deprive the country of their services. So for Lincoln, that's who he wanted to listen to. And these were the people that were most likely to confront him or challenge him or raise opinions about his plans that might differ from his own. It takes a certain kind of person to do what Lincoln did. It takes a certain kind of person to listen to the people who are not just going to tell you what you want to hear, who are not just going to be yes men, so to speak, who will do more than just reinforce and rubber stamp the things that you already want or think or believe. It takes a certain kind of person to choose who you're going to listen to differently. I think there's a word for that kind of person. That word is courageous. And our lesson tonight from Chronicles is about that kind of courage. This lesson comes from the life of a king named Jehoshaphat. It's from 2 Chronicles 17 through 20, if you'd like to get out a Bible and be turning there. It's funny, I don't think that I have seen Jehoshaphat on many of the lists of the popular baby names for boys. I've looked at a lot of names. I don't think I remember seeing that anywhere. That being said, Jehoshaphat, like his father Asa, was counted amongst the good kings of Judah. In fact, we read in 2 Chronicles 17, beginning in verse 3, that the Lord was with Jehoshaphat because he walked in the earlier ways of his father David. He did not seek the Baals, but sought the God of his father and walked in his commandments and not according to the practices of Israel. Therefore, the Lord established the kingdom in his hand, and all Judah brought tribute to Jehoshaphat, and he had great riches and honor. And I want you to get this next part especially. This is what they say about Jehoshaphat. His heart was courageous in the ways of the Lord. His heart was courageous in the ways of the Lord. So Jehoshaphat, we're told, is a courageous person. And if you look at the full scope of his life, you're going to see that play out in a whole lot of the ways that we would normally talk about courage. And we'll actually get to some of this next week. Like, for example, in chapters 19 and 20 of 2 Chronicles, we see how Jehoshaphat shows courage in the battlefield. He shows courage in those sort of acts of great valor and honor when the enemy is pressing in on every side. And we often think about courage in a situation like that. Jehoshaphat has that. He says one of the most memorable things when they're about to go into battle from the entire book, and we'll talk a lot about that next week. But tonight, the question that our passage invites us to consider is whether Jehoshaphat will show courage in a very different kind of way. Will Jehoshaphat show courage like Abraham Lincoln's? Meaning, will he show the courage to let himself be challenged? Is Jehoshaphat willing to seek God's voice and God's direction in the choices that he makes? Is he willing to do so even when he might have to change the plans that he has in mind? Does Jehoshaphat have the courage to be challenged? Or will he find it easier to only listen to those people in his life who are going to reinforce or rubber stamp what he already wants, what he already thinks? So this is the question that sort of comes to the fore in a little kind of complicated chapter, 2 Chronicles chapter 18. So let's take a look at this real quick together. I'm going to read a little bit of it, and then we'll pause and discuss. 2 Chronicles 18, beginning in verse 1, it says, "Now Jehoshaphat had great riches and honor, and he made a marriage alliance with Ahab. And after some years, he went down to Ahab in Samaria, and Ahab killed an abundance of sheep and oxen for Jehoshaphat and for the people who were with him, and induced him to go up against Ramoth Gilead." Now, Ramoth Gilead used to be this city of Israel, but sometime or another in the recent years, it had been taken over by the armies of the Syrians who lived to the north of Israel. But now, Ahab, king of Israel, he wants to take it back. So Ahab, king of Israel, said to Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, "Will you go with me to Ramoth Gilead?" Jehoshaphat answered him, "I am as you are, my people as your people. We will be with you in the war. However," Jehoshaphat said to the king of Israel, "Inquire first for the word of the Lord." Then the king of Israel gathered the prophets together, 400 men, and said to them, "Shall we go to battle against Ramoth Gilead, or shall I refrain?" And they said, "Go up, for God will give it into the hand of the king." But Jehoshaphat said, "Is there not here another prophet of the Lord, of whom we may inquire?" Now, let's just pause right here and kind of take stock of some of what we've just heard. So, first of all, we have Jehoshaphat. He's the king of Judah, and he makes this alliance with whom? He makes this alliance with Ahab. Ahab, king of Israel. Does that name ring a bell for anybody? For some of you, you may remember Ahab if you remember looking at the stories of the life of Elijah. He was the king in Israel during a lot of the time when Elijah was a prophet for the Lord. He was the king in Israel who married Jezebel. He was the king in Israel when the Lord said that it's not going to rain, and then it didn't rain for 3 whole years. He's the king who sort of gets enticed to envy Naboth's vineyard. He gets kind of enticed into the worship of these other gods and the Baals and all of these different things. Like basically, if you were going to make a Mount Rushmore of the kings of Israel who were the best and the wisest and the brightest, Ahab would not be on that mountain. He is not one of their best ones. But Jehoshaphat has made this alliance with him. And now he's putting his head together with Ahab about whether they should go to war. What does Jehoshaphat want to do? Something really good, right? Jehoshaphat wants to know first and foremost. He's interested, but he wants to know before he gets into this, what is God's will in all of this? Let's inquire of the Lord first, he says. Let's not just ask what does Ahab wants. This is not just about what do I want. This is not just about what makes the most political sense for me as the king of Judah. This is not just about what's going to bring me riches and honor. No, what is the will of God for this decision? So he says to Ahab, let's inquire first for the word of the Lord. Not a bad thing, right? So then Ahab gathers together 400 prophets. And what do they all say? Go for it. You got this. You're going to do great. God's got your back. You're going to succeed. And then there's the most interesting part to me. Even though there have been 400 prophets who have all said the same thing, go for it, Jehoshaphat still says, anybody else we can ask? Anybody else we can ask about this? And I think it's right here that we get our first clue about this group of advisors that Ahab has assembled around them. Maybe not the best group to listen to. 400 prophets all say, yes, 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 yes. Jehoshaphat looks at them and says, anybody else? And then the kicker. Ahab says, well, there is yet one man by whom we may inquire of the Lord, Micaiah, the son of Imlah, but I hate him. Why? For he never prophesies good concerning me, only evil. So you catch that? He says, well, we could ask Micaiah, but I don't like to ask him anything because he never tells me what I want to hear. He never says anything good when I ask him. He's not like the 400 yes men who have just rubber stamped my decision to go out to war. Micaiah never prophesies anything good concerning me, so I don't like to ask him. What do you think of that? Do you think this is a good path that Ahab is going down here? You and I can see from 1,000 miles away why this is not a good road to go down. He's just surrounding himself with people who are going to say what he wants to hear. We can spot from a mile away that this is not good. But can we spot it in our own lives? And can we sometimes be a little bit like Ahab sometimes? Can I share with you a story from the life of Jesus that just haunts me? Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. Let's get there. Where'd it go? We lost Jesus in the synagogue. That happened actually in Luke chapter 2. We're going to talk about Luke chapter 13 instead. Thank you, Jerry, for getting us back up here. We'll get Jesus in the synagogue here. There we go. Luke chapter 13. Now, Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. And just then there appeared a woman with the spirit that had crippled her for 18 years. She was bent over, was quite unable to stand up straight. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said, "Woman, you are set free from your ailment." And when he laid his hands on her, immediately she stood up straight and began praising God. And this is all wonderful and exciting. Here's the part that haunts me. But the leader of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had cured on the Sabbath, kept saying to the crowd, "There are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be cured, and not on the Sabbath day." And when he says this, he's quoting the Bible. Exodus chapter 20, verse 9, 6 days you shall labor and do all of your work. Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 13, 6 days you shall labor and do all of your work. He knows his Bible, but is he listening to God? Is Jesus trying to challenge his understanding with what he did that day in the synagogue? Will he have the courage to be challenged, to actually let God sharpen him and correct him and shape him? Sadly not. Instead, the poor guy just stands up next to Jesus and challenges God to a teach-off. He's going to stand up there and teach this crowd why what God just did is not what God actually wants. And instead of listening to God and letting God challenge his understanding, instead he just tells the crowd, what you've just seen from God is not it. Man, when I read this story, I just want to come over to the poor fellow and like sit him down and say, "Shh. I know you think you know. And I know you think even Scripture's backing you up on this, but are you so sure that you understand God's will? Are you so sure that you don't need to say like Jehoshaphat, let's inquire from the Lord first?" And the reason I say this story haunts me is because I know that I could be the poor synagogue leader. I know that I could be him. So I need to be very, very careful. And I need to have the courage to be challenged. I need to have the courage to let God continue to challenge my understanding, even and especially when I think I know best, or maybe when I want it my way the most. Those are really the times I need it. That's really when I need to hit the pause button, right? And say, like Jehoshaphat said, let's inquire of the Lord about this. Because the Lord answered this poor synagogue leader, "You hypocrite. Does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and then lead it to the water? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 years long, be set free from this bondage on the Sabbath day?" And when he said this, all his opponents were put to shame, and the entire crowd was rejoicing at all the wonderful things being done by him. That story really speaks to my heart because it reminds me that I can be like Ahab if I'm not careful. It reminds me of how much easier it is to only hear what I want to hear instead of having the courage to listen for God's voice, even if it challenges me. So Ahab says, "I don't want to talk to Micaiah. He never tells me what I want to hear." But Jehoshaphat says to that, "Let's get him in here. Let not the king say that. Let's get Micaiah here." To his credit, Jehoshaphat recognizes that this may be exactly the person that they need to be listening to, even if Ahab doesn't like it very much. So they bring Micaiah in. And the time constraints here are going to keep me from reading this whole next part, but I want to summarize it. It's kind of complicated if you go through and read some of all of the back and forths that happen here. Essentially, what happens is they inquire of Micaiah, should we go into the battle? And Micaiah basically tells them two things. Thing number one, if you do go to battle, contrary to what the 400 prophets have just told you, if you go into battle, you will lose. Micaiah says, I saw all Israel scattered on the mountains as sheep that have no shepherd. This is what awaits them if they fight. And the second thing Micaiah says is that this is actually part of God's will. So we talked about how Ahab, not the best king. Well, Micaiah says the Lord has declared disaster concerning Ahab. And what does Ahab say in response to all of this? He says, didn't I tell you that he would not prophesy good about me, but evil? Didn't I tell you I didn't want to listen to this guy? And so he seizes Micaiah, puts the fellow in prison, says, feed him with meager rations of bread and water until I return in peace. And Micaiah says, ominously, if you return in peace, the Lord has not spoken by me. And wouldn't you know it, Ahab and Jehoshaphat go into this battle anyway. They go to battle, which in some sense is ignoring, but in another sense is fulfilling God's will in this paradoxical way. And while in battle, a certain man drew his bow at random and struck the king of Israel between the scale armor and the breastplate, that being Ahab. And the battle continued that day, and the king of Israel was propped up in his chariot facing the Syrians until the evening, and then he died. So things turn out just like Micaiah said that they would, if only Ahab had had the courage to be challenged. But he didn't. Meanwhile, there's Jehoshaphat. And his is the harder part of this story to really decipher, because all throughout he sets many a good example. Jehoshaphat is the one who says, we ought to inquire from the Lord first about all of this. Jehoshaphat is also the one who says, is anybody else here who can advise us instead of all these people who just say yes? Jehoshaphat is the one who says, let's get Micaiah in here and listen to him, knowing full well that it was going to be a challenging word he speaks. And yet Jehoshaphat also still goes into the battle anyway. I don't know what to make of that exactly. Is it because Jehoshaphat realized that this was God's will and that things were going to happen this way? Is it because Jehoshaphat had already promised to be an ally to Ahab and he wanted to be true to his word? Or is it because when push came to shove, Jehoshaphat still had that place in his heart that was unwilling to be challenged? And though he'd made room for God to speak something he did not want to hear, at the end of the day, he didn't have the courage to act on that word and be changed. I don't know the answer. I do know that true change is hard and courageous work. And I am not always as good or as courageous about it as I need to be. And I need God's help, God's patience, and God's grace to become what he wants me to be. And maybe this story speaks to you too. Maybe you need God's help too. Do you need to have the courage to be challenged in your life? Do you need to have the courage to inquire of the Lord first, rather than assuming that your ways and your wants are the best ways, the ways we ought to go? If we as a church can help you in prayer, help you with discernment, help you with encouragement, we'd love to do that for you. If we as a church can spur one another on to love and good works, even challenge one another as is fitting in love and in humility, then we ought to do that for one another. Or tonight, if you need to respond to the gospel, That invitation is open today as well. Only God can make us a new creation, where the old is gone and the new has come, and that change in us is complete. And maybe you need to take hold of the opportunity to experience that grace in baptism. However you might be called, or however you might be challenged tonight, we offer this invitation as we stand and sing.